bands that got me into metal were definitely Black Sabbath, Kiss, Rainbow, Iron Maiden, and Judas Priest, I'd have to say.
In the very early days, when I was very young, I guess the first metal band that I ever heard was Black Sabbath. I'm not sure I really understood what I was hearing at the time, but it certainly left a mark on me. I must have subliminally absorbed that sort of ominous tone because I think it changed the way I look at music, and it kind of set the stage for what was to come. Fast forward a few years to the early 80s, and bands like Twisted Sister and Motley Crue, Quiet Riot and Wasp were all coming onto the scene. All those early hair bands. It was a pretty exciting time because it was all new and fresh. Then I guess bands like Accept and Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and Metallica and Anthrax and Megadeth came onto my radar, and they changed everything. I remember back in the day going to this little hole-in-the-wall record store in the heart of Melbourne called Central Station Records. We'd catch the train in after school on a Friday night and buy whatever we could afford at the time. A little later on, when I started my apprenticeship, I'd go in there after trade school and buy an album every single week. Man, those were the days. Everything was fresh and new and so much to discover. I really miss those days.
The main bands that got me into progressive metal would have to be Fate's Warning, Queensryche, and Dream Theater.
I guess music's like a drug, you know. You sort of move from one thing to the next. You're always looking for that, you know, that next exciting band or thing, or that stylistic shift that pushes things in a different direction. It wasn't until stuff like early Queensryche and early Fate's Warning that I knew I'd sort of discovered something really special. I didn't know it at the time, but that style of music would remain with me and kind of captivate me for, you know, the next 40 odd years and beyond. But once I found that new sound, all the other straighter metal sounding bands began to fade sort of into the background. Not that I gave up on that style of straighter metal, it just didn't hold my attention as much anymore. Now it was more about the new thing, you know, this new sound. I should say, you know, whenever one of those straighter metal bands from back in the day release a new album, I still check it out. I'm still interested to hear what they're, you know, coming up with, and I still enjoy that whole thing, but it's more from a nostalgic point of view. I mean, I grew up on that shit, so it's always nice to sort of revisit those bands when something new comes out. So I guess one thing leads to another, you know, one band to another, and on it goes. In the early days of prog metal, there really wasn't that much about in Australia. There was Queensryche and Fate's Warning and, you know, Psychotic Waltz and Watchtower and Dream Theater as well as bands like Halloween, you know, maybe Sanctuary and King Diamond and Savatage and Crimson Glory. Oh man, so many great bands. There were other lesser known bands obviously, but I guess these were the bands that were leading the charge, so to speak. However, you know, the three main bands and albums that changed my life at that point were probably Fate's Warning, Perfect Symmetry, Queensryche, Mindcrime, and Psychotic Waltz, The Social Grace. The Social Grace in particular for me was an absolute game changer when it came out. Everything on that album was just solid gold. Such a big influence on me. That album just changed music for me forever. Just the complexity and layering, the playing, the songwriting, the vocal melodies, the lyrics, and of course the vocal performance. The whole thing just blew my head off. At that point too, or maybe slightly a bit later on, I should also mention my listening journey also took me down several side alleys. It wasn't always about metal. I also listened to and loved bands like Rush and Yes and Genesis, stuff like that. And there was also a period where I really got into classical music in a very big way.
The bands that influenced me mostly, especially in a writing sense, was definitely Queensryche, Fate's Warning, Sabotage, Crimson Glory. Definitely bands of that nature. And of course, sprinkles some Sabbath. There's always got to be Sabbath. I'd say that'd be the main bands that influenced me musically.
Oh man, all the bands that I mentioned earlier, they all played a part in how I played bass at the time and how I approach music to this day. They were all pioneers in their own way. They were playing a style of music that wasn't widely recognised or supported, and it's amazing to me that some of those bands are still around today. They made it through those tough early days when the genre was in its sort of, primordial stages. There wouldn't have been a lot of money around in those days, and it was probably an absolute struggle to keep things on the road and to push forward. But some of those bands managed to persevere, and they're still putting out amazing music to this day. So bass-wise, when I think back to the early vaudeville days, when we were writing music, bands like Fate's Warning, Queensryche and Psychotic Waltz, and even Dream Theater were huge influences on the way I approached the instrument. But for the most part, I knew my limitations, so there was no point trying to copy anyone else stylistically. So ultimately, I just sort of decided to do my own thing and to find my own voice. I also saw bass as not just the bottom end instrument, but as a melodic voice within the band. That certainly is not standard practice in most situations, but that's kind of where I was coming from and how I approached the writing process, especially in the early days of vaudeville.
Those bands definitely influenced my approach towards writing music. I love that style, so it was a style that I wanted to play, and just the way they write, the melody but still have power, the way they structure songs was really appealing to me, and so I definitely wanted to write in a similar vein, not directly rip them off or anything like that, but definitely it was a huge influence on my songwriting.
I think all of these bands taught us what was possible in terms of songwriting and musicianship. Some of the albums I mentioned earlier are absolute classics, and in a lot of ways they've never been surpassed. I mean, how do you top an album like Mindcrime? It's impossible. It's perfection. What these great bands and albums did was inspired us to pick up an instrument and just to have a go. I mean, when you hear an album like, say, Awaken the Guardian by Fate's Warning for the first time, it's impossible not to be influenced by it. I forgot to mention this album earlier, but this slab of music in particular changed the way I went about writing music. The melodic content on this album is unparalleled to this day, both musically and vocally. It's one of those albums that just gets better and better the more time you spend with it. All of these early progressive bands just showed us the way and inspired us to be better. It's as simple as that, really.
Oh, look, I think those bands are still my influences and probably always will be my influences. I have tended to reach more back into the past, back to my roots, like more into the Sabbath kind of era of late, just because I really dig it. And but look, I'm always open to new influences. But yeah, look, those main influences will always be there in some shape or form.
These days, to be honest, I try not to let other bands or musicians influence me too much. I think at this point, I'm just trying to do my own thing. I write all the keyboard parts in Runes of Autumn. They're not complex in any way, shape or form. In fact, they're pretty simplistic overall. There's so many great keyboard players out there at the moment who are doing amazing things with the instrument. Even if I wanted to be inspired by them, I couldn't actually physically play like them. So there's no point in me trying to mimic their style or copy how they sound. I just do what I do and try to give each song what I think it needs, and I just try to be myself. When I listen to other progressive metal bands who feature keyboards, most, if not all of them, use keyboards in a very different way. The keyboards are much more musical in terms of playing and composition. Lots of notes, soloing, and flashy sort of look at me playing. I much prefer the keys to be atmospheric in nature rather than having them play a lead role. I really love playing the keys in Runes of Autumn. It's super fun working with all the different sounds and atmospheres, but I have absolutely no desire to be adding keyboard solos to any of our songs. It's just not what I want to hear or do. As far as bass guitar goes, same deal really. I haven't really played much bass over the past few years. I've been much more focused on the keyboards and running the back end of the bands we've been in. We've had some amazing bass players with us at various times in both Mechanical Organic and Runes of Autumn, so it just didn't seem like it was necessary for me to strap on the bass. But now that it's just down to Dave and I, I'm really looking forward to getting reacquainted with the instrument. It's going to be really fun seeing what comes out musically. I've already started fooling around with some bottom end ideas, and it's sounding pretty cool so far. Okay, well that's it for now. We'll catch you again next month. Don't forget to check out our new track, The Trip, available on all streaming services online and from our BANDCAMP page. Share and comment if you can, it helps us out immensely. We really appreciate everyone who has been doing so. We'll catch you again next month. Okay, thanks again.